This recording was created by His Majesty's 9th Regiment of Foot, a recreated infantry company dedicated to preserving the history of the American War of Independence through reenactments and other living history events. Do please check us out on Facebook and Instagram. Chapter 1. Various are the causes which induced individuals to commit the incidents of their own lives to writing and submit them to the world. Vanity has urged several to publish transactions which had been much better reserved in secret, as matters of repentance and motives to amendment. Avarice has stimulated others to fabricate tissues of falsehood, palatable to the public taste, but exceedingly injurious to unwary readers. Party and prejudice have had no small share in private memoirs, whilst even religion itself has been so misconceived by weak, though well-meaning persons, as to furnish a leading inducement for laying before mankind an indiscreet exposure of their lives and actions, which ultimately proved deeply detrimental to the solid interests of piety and truth. Fully aware of these powerful objections, the author ruminated much before he ventured to add one to the number of those who have published their own biography. But when he recollects what he was, when he feels what the Almighty has done for him, when he balances his present comforts against his past transgressions, when he thinks on the probability that his example may not be altogether without its moral and spiritual utility, when he considers the misrepresentations and falsehoods that have gone abroad relative to the important affairs in which he was personally engaged, the many exalted characters under whom he served in the army, and the facts concerning them, of which he is in possession, when he knows that the experience of his life supplies a plentiful harvest of interesting anecdote, he believes he does not assert too much when he declares that he should hold himself inexcusable to his king, his country, his officers, to the public, and himself, if he suffered the grave to close forever on his story without leaving some memorial behind him. These considerations induced him to publish a life, in which he has many things to deplore, and more to call forth his gratitude both to heaven and earth. I drew my first breath in the city of Dublin on the 17th of January, 1756, of humble, industrious, and virtuous parents. I was the youngest of 11 children. My eldest brother sacrificed his life in defense of his country. He died in consequence of a wound which he received on board one of the king's ships. At the time of his death, I was only 5 years old, but I remember that my father was greatly afflicted at it, and the more so when he found my inclination of mind was also to the sea. Considering his situation, which, though reputable, was far from affluent, and the labor necessary to support his family, he was a man of much reading, which strong native powers of intellect had led him to digest and methodize. He was far from being unacquainted with seafaring matters. I well remember, when a child, walking with him down the north wall, he would describe to me, in the most easy and interesting manner, a naval engagement, and by the most apt and familiar transition, turn the discourse to the battles which were then fighting between the English and the French. I am aware that my father's motive, while he amused me in these conversations, was to instruct. But he little imagined that in doing so, he was kindling a martial ardor in my young breast, which might, and ultimately did, lead my heedless steps into the very dangers he would have wished me to shun, and against which he would have guarded me with the fondest anxiety. At length, he began to perceive his error, for when he discovered my attention engrossed by these subjects, with tears in his eyes, he would say, "Ah, my dear child, I see your little breast is fired with this account. I only relate these things to inform your judgment. I have lost one fine boy already in fighting for his country. Surely you would never leave your father. You must stay with me and your mother, and be our support and comfort in our old days." Much as I loved my father, and deep as these affectionate speeches sunk into my mind, they had a tendency which he little imagined when he first used them. It was from these discourses of my father that an anxious desire was first raised in my mind for a seafaring life. Our house being contiguous to the river Liffey, I was a constant frequenter of its quays and the places where the shipping were moored. There I soon acquired the art of climbing up the masts of the vessels. At the age of 6 years, I began to practice the art of swimming, but by my temerity, I was near losing my life at that tender period. This circumstance occurred in the old dock near the spot where the new custom house now stands. The tide was full in, and, in imitation of some grown lads who practiced these leaps and feats of activity, I jumped from off the steps. I soon, however, found that what I had before thought swimming in shallow water was but the paddling of a child, for I sunk like a stone in nearly 10 feet of water. Among the spectators, providentially for me, were many expert swimmers, one of whom, observing that I did not rise to the surface of the water, immediately plunged in and took me up, almost dead. This circumstance, far from deterring me from going again into the water, only made me more eager to acquire perfection in the art of swimming, in which, after some time, I became such a proficient that from off the bowsprits and round tops of ships I frequently leapt head foremost into the river. I now recollect the dangers to which I exposed myself on the watery element, even before I had attained my 9th year. I recognize with gratitude the protecting arm divine, and, in humble adoration of that providence which has hitherto guided me in safety through the progress of an eventful life, am led to say, with the poet, "Oft hath the sea confessed thy power, and given me back to thy command. It could not, Lord, my life devour, safe in the hollow of thy hand." Chapter 2. I had not yet attained my 8th year. Nevertheless, such was my predilection in favor of a seafaring life, that it did not escape the observation of my father. He was much grieved at the discovery, and frequently laid before me in the most fond and anxious manner the distresses and dangers to which sailors are exposed. Giddy, unthinking, bent on marine pursuits, this had little effect on me. However, a circumstance happened at that time in Dublin, in the year 1766, which in a great degree turned my mind against its favorite pursuit. It was as follows. I have mentioned that it was the usage of my father to walk with me on the banks of the Liffey and the quays of the harbor. In one of these amusing and instructive little rambles which my affectionate parent always tried to turn to my advantage, he carried me, no doubt on purpose, along the south wall and near the pigeon house, in the direction of the lighthouse, where at present the wall is extended by that strong and beautiful work which adds so greatly to the advantage and ornament of the city. Here were hung in chains, on gibbets, 4 criminals, whose dreadful offense almost appears to have called down the avenging hand of divine justice itself to arrest and exhibit them as terrible examples to individuals in general. They were purposely exposed in the mouth of the harbor as a warning to seafaring men. The exposure and the whole circumstance of the affair proved a powerful dissuasive to prevent me, at that time, from entertaining the desire which before engaged my thoughts. I no longer wished for the sea. The story of this case is so highly interesting that it may not be amiss to relate it as a lesson to the thoughtless and dissipated. A merchant ship, the Earl of Sandwich, bound to London from Orotava, and laden with wine, Spanish dollars, gold dust, and jewels, proceeded on her passage into the English Channel, when Peter McKinley, boatswain, George Gidley, cook, Richard St. Quintin, and Andrew Zickerman, mariners, conspired to murder John Cochrane, master, Charles Pinchant, mate, James Pinchant, mariner, Benjamin Gillespie, cabin boy, together with Captain Glass, his wife and daughter, and their servant boy. In pursuance of this inhuman plot, on the 30th of November, 1765, the conspirators keeping the night watch, and the master going on the quarter-deck to see if all were safe, McKinley and Gidley knocked him on the head with an iron bar and threw him overboard. The noise and groans of the master brought Captain Glass from below, who was murdered with his own sword. The Pynchons were soon dispatched in a similar manner. Mrs. Glass and her child, imploring mercy from the ruffians, were tossed into the sea. Having altered their course and made for the coast of Ireland, they landed on the 3rd of December, some leagues distant from Waterford. They then loaded a boat with treasure and left the vessel with her ballast port opened, and the 2 boys who survived in her to sink, as she soon did. One of the boys following the boat was struck on the head with the gunwale and drowned. The other lad they saw washed from the ship's deck as she overset and filled with water. They now flattered themselves that the deceased could not disclose their secret, or the sea give any evidence against them, and having buried 250 bags of dollars, they reserved in their possession, and for the use the remainder, along with the jewels and gold. Yet after all this extraordinary precaution, their appearance and prodigal manner of living caused them to be looked on as suspicious individuals, and the ship which they thought could never stir from the bottom of the great deep rose from her watery bed and was washed near Waterford on the shore. The ship so circumstanced caused much speculation, and turned the suspicions of some persons to the murderers, who had left the neighborhood and come to Dublin, where they continued to pass their time in great excess and expense. In the meantime, 2 gentlemen repaired to Dublin in the hopes of apprehending them, and having taken the necessary steps, Quentin and Zickerman were secured, and being examined apart, they confessed the commission of the horrid crime, and also that their ruffian associates, Gidley and McKinley, sold dollars to the amount of £300 in Dublin. By the means of the goldsmith who bought the silver, McKinley was seized, and 2 men who were immediately sent off to search for the buried treasure which had been robbed from the ship fell in with and took the remaining offender, Gidley, making his escape toward Cork from justice, which seems to have followed those murderous wretches with a swift and unerring step, until all of them were brought to the conviction and awful punishment which they so highly deserved, and which even shows that an almighty providence, though sometimes slow in interposing to visit the wicked for murder, is by no means, regardless of the blood of man, crying from the ground for vengeance. When I was 11 years of age, I began to entertain a strong desire to leave home. My father, ever anxious to comply with my wishes, yielded to an offer which presented itself, and consented that I should go with a friend of his to the country. This proposal was joyfully received by me, and preparations were accordingly made for my departure to the north of Ireland. The gentleman who thus took charge of me was going to visit his sister, a Mrs. Hines, near Killashandra, in the county of Cavan, and some other relations which he had in the county of Westmeath. But it was to his uncle, who was my father's great friend, that I was principally indebted on this occasion. On my father's application, he recommended me to his nephew, with the warmth of a friend and the authority of a parent. This gentleman, whose name was Howard, was a respectable merchant in Jervis Street. He was a man well acquainted with the world and all its vanities, which he happily forsook for the more solid enjoyments of religion and the more laudable pursuits of virtue. Chapter 3. Having stopped 6 weeks in the country with the nephew of Mr. William Howard, and being much gratified with the tour from the new scenes which it afforded, interesting to a young mind like mine, I returned to Dublin. On my arrival in town, my attention became greatly occupied in expectation of going to North America, in company with Mr. Howard's son, who had obtained a commission in a marching regiment which was serving there. I besought my father to intercede with young Mr. Howard to take me along with him. But although my indulgent parent agreed in compliance with my ardent wishes to mention the matter to Mr. Howard, there could be no situation procured in the regiment for a boy such as I then was. I was obliged, therefore, to remain at home, and the disappointment very much distressed me. But I resolved at all events to depart for America, and, in pursuance of my determination, I seized an opportunity which soon offered, of entering on board a vessel destined for that part of the world. However, my father, being apprised of my purpose, interfered with the captain of the ship, paid my expenses on board, and so prevented my intended plan of folly for a time. I remained at home, a disappointed idler, and like most boys who have not received the unspeakable advantage, of a truly religious education, became delighted with every folly that but too fatally captivate the juvenile mind. Did youth but seriously consider half the snares and temptations to which they are exposed, they would perceive that early industry and a constant application to business are, under the divine guidance, the best preservatives. At that period, the administration of justice was greatly relaxed in the city of Dublin. It was almost impossible for persons to walk through some parts of the city, particularly on Sunday evenings, without encountering the most violent and sometimes dangerous assaults. Lower Abbey and Marlborough Streets on the north side of the city, and the Long Lane near Kevin Street on the south, were the places for general rendezvous for club law, as it was vulgarly called. Here, numbers of daring, desperate fellows used to assemble, form themselves in battle array, and cut and maim each other without either mercy or remorse. Whether influenced by these scenes of personal contest, or from a natural and inherent love of military life, I will not presume to determine. But at this early period of my life, the small sword exercise became my favorite pursuit. But not meeting with a sufficient number of adversaries to exhibit my skill and keep my hand in practice, this in its turn, of course, I abandoned. 'Tis granted, and no plainer truth appears, our most important are our earliest years. The mind, impressible and soft with ease, imbibes and copies what she hears and sees, and through life's labyrinth holds fast the clue that education gives her, false or true. Plants raised with tenderness are seldom strong, man's coltish disposition asks the thong, and without discipline the favorite child, like a neglected forester, runs wild. But we, as if good qualities would grow, spontaneous take but little pains to sow. We give him Latin and a smatch of Greek, teach him to fence and figure twice a week, and having done, we think, the best we can, praise his proficiency and dub him man.